I'd also like to acknowledge Josh Learners that are here. We're meeting today, and thank you very much. Just wanted to, can I first quickly ask, is anybody familiar with the Atlas of Living Australia? Yeah, two people, one or two notes. Excellent. So it gives me a general idea. Basically, I wanted to talk today a little bit about ALA as a sort of a digital infrastructure and talk about Indigenous knowledge and digital ecological knowledge and where that might fit in something like the Atlas. Just to give you a quick background, so the Atlas is a national collaborative research infrastructure, so it's funded through the NCRIS and it's hosted by CSIRO. But really, and it's also a node of GBIF, which is a global biodiversity infrastructure, so a lot of data from the ALA feeds up into that international space as well. And it has a number of uses. Others use the data that's in there to inform policy to undertake different types of projects as well. This just gives you a quick overview of the Atlas and the investment that we've had to date and under the recent this funding, we've got some future funding as well, or commitment to funding. The Atlas really came out of the museums and collections community. There's really broadened since then in terms of its demographic as to who provides data and uses the Atlas as well. It's one of those sort of key infrastructures. You may have been familiar with similar ones like Turn that does a lot of the systematic survey-based data collection, most from a marine perspective as well. And some of those underlying structures like method and sort of changing the names as well to provide information generally provide infrastructures around data and data type services. One of the sort of key features of the Atlas is it's an open infrastructure and open in many different ways, both in terms of the open access and open data concepts, but also the software that sits under the Atlas is sort of an open source data. We have, we aggregate, and that's an important thing to take into account as well. ALA is on the data that's in it. It's an aggregator of data from very many different sources. And if you look at the Atlas, some of its dashboard will show where those records come from, whether it's from citizen scientists, from government, from museums and collections as well. And it's really increasing in terms of its the types, the number of records we have in it's about 75 million as well. There are all sorts of different data sets. We used to sort of count how many billions of records were downloaded, but it's becoming too exponential with the downloading potentially the entire database around those curved records as well. It does a lot of different things around data capture and aggregation, provides different tools to manage information as well, and for people to sort of visualise that data, especially in the spatial context as well. This really just gives you an overview of the system as such as an open infrastructure. It really has all these different types of information and metadata, images around the species, and again, it's biodiversity oriented as well. And all the metadata associated with those different types of information. And it really, as an infrastructure, operates as a sort of bits and pieces or platforms or apps and web services or the way that those different, I'm telling you being technical, you get a different job if you're talking to about sort of software developers. They really have the different components that support one another through web services. And you come into that Atlas, it's one infrastructure. There are many different systems, the way that you can come into it or see it. One way is through the ALA form itself. You can also create different views of the Atlas or start out your own versions of what data you want to see. So, for instance, the dairy people can have their own view of all that data in there as well. Murray Darling Basin, for instance, Authority can see its data that's in the Atlas in its own context, but also bring in other people's data. And we can create any sort of system or view over the top of that as well. You can also, because it's an open structure, you can actually take the entire ALA components and create separate instances of it as well. So these ones are really just, the ALA sits underneath it, the main infrastructure. You can create your own instances of the ALA as well. And one, but also because can draw on the Atlas services as well. And a good example is Quest Again, which is a sort of an app, sort of a kit gamification of going out and finding data. It draws on the ALA web services to say how species distribution, how if it's rare or not, and get more bulk points if you're collecting information about that as well. But because it's an open infrastructure, it's been taken up by a number of different other countries. I think it's around 14, 15 countries now that are using the infrastructure as their national biodiversity portal. That's, I think it's France, Spain, Brazil, Costa Rica, and the entire UK. So that's enabled actually the mobilisation of quite a lot of new data internationally as well. And a broader community of practices developing around that infrastructure so that you can take up that database or that infrastructure and reuse it for a particular purpose or components of it as well. What I really people can play with the Atlas as well. That you can come in different ways. You can from a kindergarten person to a researcher as well, and different tools in there. But I won't go into the sort of different functionality. That's another whole long presentation as well on the Atlas. But happy to take some of those questions later on if you'd like. But what I want to talk about today is the sort of role of something like an infrastructure like the Atlas around Indigenous knowledge. I think it's a fundamental role to try to recognise Indigenous knowledge as a legitimate part of our Australia's knowledge around biodiversity as well, along other forms of knowledge, whether that's from museums or from collections or from citizen science. But we also need to sort of recognise the sort of foundational role that history and colonialism has had on the treatment and the construction of Indigenous knowledge and what or how that can be perpetuated in some ways through the emergence of digital infrastructures and also how we can actually potentially change some of that through those future evolution of digital infrastructures like the Atlas. And I suppose if I sort of sit back and look at the Atlas as a national infrastructure, I think we have an opportunity and also a responsibility to address some of those issues, whether it's in a small way or not, around control and recognition of the diversity of ways of knowing around Indigenous knowledge. And these are some of the sort of thoughts about those different types of roles that we can play as an infrastructure. Part of what the Atlas is doing as well, it has a whole program of work in different focus areas. But one of those focus areas that Rebecca and I are working on is Indigenous ecological program, knowledge program work, IA program work, setting up really a recognition that we need to respect and recognise the sort of value and ownership of Indigenous ecology, give that prominence in something like the Atlas, and how Indigenous peoples can use the Atlas for their particular purposes, whatever that may be as well. And that, part of it too is recognition of this sort of two-way participation or two-way sharing of knowledge as well. Recognise the Atlas as really primarily Western-based science and taxonomy in the way that it's structured, but is there a sort of two-way sharing of information that we could look at? Now, the different sort of outputs that we can look at from engagement, awareness, education, capacity, but really ALA's focus is primarily in sort of data space and also in the platforms. Some of the other projects, and we've got a sort of portfolio of projects that we're sort of using and testing and prototyping as well that may address some of these other output areas. But from an infrastructure point of view, we're sort of really interested in how to support some of the data knowledge components and those sorts of services or interfaces for Indigenous ecological knowledge. And one of the other sort of contexts as well, like I mentioned, the Atlas is again, very taxonomy based in terms of the way it's structured and the basis of it as well. But there are other ways that you can visualise or understand knowledge as well, whether that's a seasonal way of looking at knowledge, language, one of my favourite things, learning our original language, or even different worldviews. How do you bring together different concepts around breeding plants, people into a digital platform? Can you, or can it be represented in that way. And you'll see a real emergence of a lot of different apps and digital platforms out there. You know, Arrow Shires is one of the examples. You'll see a lot of language apps out there. And so we're sort of looking at as an underlying national infrastructure, research-based infrastructure, how can we support some of these different ways of looking at and understanding knowledge? One way that I look at it, and this is thinking about it in terms of the information supply chain, the way that you collect data, and that data can come from different sources. And again, like I mentioned, the information that comes into Atlas can come through surveys that people have undertaken, citizen science, remote sensing to a certain extent. But there are different ways that people collect data, not necessarily in Atlas. That is aggregated in different information platforms and it's used in a research context or a science context, whether it's to develop up indicators. This is sort of looking at primarily from an environmental information supply chain as well. People may do modelling to look at species distribution, undertake all sorts of different research based on some of the biodiversity, ecological knowledge that sits in the Atlas, and then looking at where does that fit then in that policy or impact part of that supply chain, whether it's to support state of the environment reporting, CBD or IHE targets, how do we undertake environmental accounts, how do people make decisions around where to invest, what to invest in the environmental space. But one thing I'm also quite interested in is trying to have infrastructures or, we have data collection tools, we have adaptation tools, with virtual laboratories, for instance, that may bring in modelling software and data software. There's all these different infrastructures, but for that information supply chain to sort of work effectively, you really need this sort of social architecture, I call it, like that, I don't like that word, that social architecture enable the flow of information. And when I talk about social architecture, it can be things like APIs, standards, metadata, can be changes in culture, where people are comfortable with, sharing information. That really impacts that flow of information as well. And this is just a diagrammatic version of that as well. But one way that I've been thinking that is appropriate is to think about, can we think of Indigenous knowledge or knowledge systems in this information supply chain as well? What are some of those platforms that are there, whether they're for two-way sharing or whether they're private sharing, as an example of which can be public, but there's key private components as well. And how does that support Indigenous land or direct research, Indigenous methods of research as well, and supporting those sorts of aspirations? So some of that flow is also impacted about, if I put the ALA into this context, we're an open infrastructure. How does a decision to share Indigenous knowledge in a public way, how does that decision made, for what purposes would that information be shared, and is it to meet certain, whatever those aspirations might be as well. So that's just sort of one way that I've been thinking about, and also recognising while it's flow this way, I think key to the concept is this feedback loops as well, that as you develop information knowledge, impacts of this and feeds back into better collection of information, for instance, or better understanding of the way that you might classify information and data. People, if you have sort of questions as I'm going along, please, I think for people to talk or take questions later on as well. So this is again just looking at using that conceptual framework, I suppose. These are some of the projects, and I'll go through some of the different pieces of work that we're working with the ALA and where they might fit into that supply chain as well. Both from some of the data collection with components through to some of the decision making, that flow and that social architecture and with that, as well as different ways of looking at knowledge, Indigenous knowledge in the ALA. So one of in that sort of flow component is looking at the digital governance components of the Atlas, and this is a piece of work I'm working on at the moment around what what are the Indigenous knowledge protocols, Indigenous cultural and intellectual property protocols, and how can they be reflected in a digital context? So, can we make certain changes to, select this license, or the way that you might show information that respects the key sort of Indigenous knowledge or protocol type processing, but also recognising that sometimes there are different, we can represent it in a digital way, so that there's a concept around, we respect or we recognise the right of Indigenous peoples to control, maintain their intellectual property, like we have under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But how do we reflect that digitally? But there may be administrative ways. Some of that can be, awareness of as we develop our platforms. It could be in the legal in terms of our terms and conditions. It could also be in the contracts. If we're contracting with people, how do we make sure some of those protocols are embedded into these different parts of the way that we do? But we also need to look at being clear and transparent about what the LA can and can't do. It is an open infrastructure, so it's not appropriate for it to be a platform to share sacred or cultural restricted information. But if we're clear about that up front, will that help? And for people to understand the impact of the flow of knowledge through something like the Atlas as well. So that's what this green dot, the sort of concept I'm working on at the moment, can we show what bits we're good at and what we're not good at, or what we need to be working on more or can't be working on as well. And different ways of showing, I'm quite a visual person, of showing that flow of information to help people to better understand what the Atlas is and does and can do. Also been looking at, I think I mentioned to you before, that knowledge of that decision-making process that happens before you put something into Indigenous knowledge into something like the Atlas. There's a whole suite of cultural decision-making processes that we're not going to, we need to respect, and that we're not going to go to fix, but we can actually help potentially inform with some ideas. So there's some work that CSIRO did for Opala, trying to understand some of the sort of risks and benefits and processes and potential tools to understand what are the risks, what should I do, some communities may be interested in commercial protection. Obviously, that's not appropriate in an Atlas context as well. But looking at some of those, better understanding of risk and better understanding of all the other best pathways to follow through that as well. One of the areas that I'm quite interested in, so my background is in intellectual property space as well, is looking at Atlas is obviously based on Creative Commons from a data perspective. I don't think we're going to really, not for a very long time, get around any other form of registrable IP, Indigenous or traditional knowledge-based registrable IP. WIPO's been World Intellectual Property Organisation has been working on that for 25, 30 years. But what are some of the sort of practical or educational or things that you can embed into systems as well? Some of this is the work of Jane Anderson in the US, Australian based as well. She's been working with a number of cultural institutions as well around how to better recognise Indigenous information or that's really is out in the public, maybe in a cultural institution. Can these traditional knowledge labels be one form of providing a degree of control or recognition, and how that might be embedded through the information supply chain? Part of the concept here as well is these sort of higher level concepts that looks, you might see a bit to me as Creative Commons, and that's where some of the inspiration came. These higher level concepts around attribution or community use or outreach. These are the purposes that could attach to a piece of information. But what I quite like about these as well is that you can work with specific communities for them to articulate what that means to me. What does outreach mean to me? What does attribution to me as an individual community? And create the system for people to develop up those labels. And then as a digital infrastructure, how can we embed that into the metadata, into the platforms that may be showing that, so that when information flows through the atlas as an aggregator and to those data users, that they can see these notices as such, associated with different parts of the technology. So this again, some of the where we see some of the developing up a proposal to funding to do this as well. But this is what we sort of see as some of the needs around what traditional knowledge may be able to address. And in the while Jane has developed a lot of these in the context of cultural institutions, are there different labels that we that need to be there that are now say ecological, because we are primarily ecological knowledge. Are there specific ecological based labels that may need to be developed up as well? And really, we think there's I think a really useful way to see how they can embed some of those RCRP or Indigenous cultural intellectual property protocols and principles into something like a digital platform. As mentioned, one of the other components is how do we look at knowledge in a different way? And seasonal calendars are one of theirs. You're familiar with the sort of care calendars that CSIRO's work with a number of communities as well. But can we look at creating platforms, digital platforms for people to create their own seasonal calendars or put their information in a digital way as well? The original ones here are in an old system, and Emma Woodward from CSIRO is working with us in the ALA to sort of look at what are new ways, what's the new ways of creating an infrastructure as well. I'm actually co-designing that with I think 3 or 4 different communities of what that visualization and what that data infrastructure would look like as well. And to give people the ability to create, edit, and preview and publish their own calendars in digital as well. Being able to include some of that dynamic content and multimedia media as well, whether it's speaking and videos, but then also having a two-way connection too. So the atlas will have information about where you might see a certain species. It may also show have its species profiles page, so you could connect through to that sort of other knowledge and the other way around as well. Again, we have another platform or tool within the atlas. So the atlas is made up of lots of different tools or platforms. One of them is called Profiles that the taxonomic community is used for the flora of Australia. So it used to have volumes of books of the definitive taxonomic analysis of flora of Australia. It has used the Profiles tool as a way of creating this collection around information about a species, not where it is, but about that species, whether it's its habitat or its taxonomy or various different things or morphology. So the two groups that have been looking at potentially using the Profiles tool, and you can create your own sort of fields as such to record different types of information. So Nocula have been looking at these types of fields as such, and we've also been working with the Colombian the other project that they're using to create their own sort of species guide or collection as well, cultural collection of information. The other thing too is how we can bring in, there are a lot of different spatial type information that may be relevant for Indigenous communities. Some of those are the spatial extents around land use agreements, protected areas. The Murray Darling, for instance, has a number of different ways that are in the atlas. So the atlas actually has a very quite sophisticated spatial portal, and it can bring in a lot of different spatial layers as such, which you can look at and sort of just say, well, show me all the different species that sit here, or those sort of things. So what are some of the other layers that we can sort of bring in for people to better understand what's happening in their area as such? So it's that place-based way of trying to find out who's doing what. So for instance, if you've brought up a particular IPA as the ranges of that IPA, you could go and see all the records that have been collected there. You could go and see the metadata of who's collected that information, who's been out there doing that over what period of time as well. So it gives you another way of looking at who's been doing what in terms of data collection in certain areas. One of the things we're very interested in as well is really understanding, as I mentioned, AI is very much based on scientific names as well. So how do we look at recognising language names for species as well? So one of the other tools we're looking at is an app, and part of it is a language name, a traps app that's bringing in languages as well for species, and we can create, anybody can create a list of species and language names, and using some of the sort of standards around names. There's a whole organisation that works on, standards associated with names and things like that. How can we sort of start to use some of these sort of tools as well to bring in language names as well? How do we actually, as I mentioned in the ALA, we show scientific names, common names, and this is just a mock-up in some respects. We're trying to say, how can we show within the context of the ALA different types of language names? Can we connect through to IATSIS and FOSLang and their language database in terms of the standards, the codes that they have with respect to language as well? One of the other ones, we worked with the CLC on looking at track stats. So some of the number of ranger groups looking at tracking scat, little footprints and things. And as a data, this is more as a data collection tool. So people can go out, rangers go out and do a survey based on a particular methodology, and sort of take note and track that. One of the features of this has also been to have it in language. So all the different fields you can spot between, this one's currently in Walker, but I think there's a few other languages now. So the app can be in actual different languages as well. And sitting underneath it is a sort of data collection tool as well, or data management tool. Part of BioCollect is again another one of those platforms within the Atlas. It's more about data collection rather than our aggregation space. So sometimes some communities may not have resources to create their own website, maybe going out to school, for instance, or a community or a group of rangers may not have. There's a number of different fantastic data collection apps out there, tools out there as well. This is just one of the ALA's version of that as well. And so people can create their own tools of collecting what I went and saw. This doesn't have to be occurrence records, it could be activities, that they've done as well. And this BioCollect is a way of collecting that information. Similarly, it can be used for rangers in collecting, as they go out and do surveys. As an example, up in Cape Pure, collecting a lot of the sort of surveys they do around fur animal and threatened species monitoring as well. Just as another bit of background as well, so the Atlas infrastructure or components of it have supported the Department of Environment's merit, it's the monitoring evaluation reporting tool. So it's the tool that, Department of Environment through its National Heritage Program, the Biodiversity Fund has spent, $1 or $2 billion funding different natural resource management projects. And a number of those, quite a number, I think about 600, have languages components as well. So this is actually a way where you can look at some of the funding or some of the projects and some of the data that's collected there. And a lot of this is activity based. I said I would plant so many trees or put up so many fences and things like that. So a lot of that data is available through the merit tool. So the ALA components of the ALA infrastructure sit underneath this government program as well. It's another example of an open infrastructure where we can reuse different components. So really that's it quickly. And I just wanted to, leave this up here, whether it might generate some questions or ideas and thoughts, and I'd welcome